establishing central control immediately. This pawn advances to claim valuable territory and open diagonal lines for bishop development. Establishing a symmetrical pawn structure, Black immediately challenges White's central pawn and vies for equal influence across the board. Opening the center immediately establishes dynamic pawn tension, a hallmark of the Queen's gambit. Solidifying the central pawn, Black prepares for queenside expansion and avoids the sharpest lines. Developing the knight now reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares for queenside expansion, creating a dynamic central struggle. Developing the knight towards the center, this move prepares for queenside expansion and potential kingside activity while contesting central control. Developing another knight solidifies central influence, preparing a flexible pawn structure and eyeing potential queenside expansion. Solidifying the center with this pawn advance prepares development while maintaining flexibility. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, immediately creating pressure and limiting Black's central pawn flexibility by forcing a decision. A pawn sacrifice, opening lines now, forcing a difficult decision about piece development and central control for White. Boldly seizing central space, White initiates a pawn storm, aiming to shatter Black's semi-Slav structure and unleash his bishop's power, potentially leading to a dynamic imbalance. Black boldly grabs a pawn, pushing the queenside pawn chain forward, but this aggressive pawn grab will require careful maneuvering to defend the newly acquired material and prevent White's central dominance from becoming overwhelming. Pioneering forward, this pawn aggressively carves out space, aiming to dislodge the knight and gain a crucial tempo, potentially opening lines towards Black's queenside and restricting Black's piece mobility while creating a dynamic pawn structure that demands careful maneuvering from both sides. Confronting the central pawn's aggressive advance, Black immediately challenges White's piece on the bishop's diagonal, forcing a decision that will shape the pawn structure and potentially expose the White King's sanctuary. This is a decisive moment, demanding careful calculation of tactical exchanges. Retreating the bishop to its original square preserves its influence on the long diagonal, subtly reinforcing central control, while preparing for potential kingside attacks and maintaining flexibility for future development. Unleashing a pawn storm, Black bravely advances on the kingside, aiming to dislodge the bishop and create attacking prospects. Yet this aggressive pawn push recklessly compromises king's safety, opening critical diagonals and potentially leaving the monarch exposed to future tactical assaults. Boldly snatching the pawn, White initiates a sharp tactical sequence, sacrificing material to disrupt Black's pawn structure and exploit the weakened kingside. This aggressive gambit forces Black into immediate defensive calculations, potentially opening lines toward the enemy monarch. Unleashing a storm of pawn advances creates a chaotic but potentially rewarding battlefield, forcing Black to embrace the tactical melee and exploit the exposed White king. Suddenly, Black's king stands exposed, a glaring target as White opens the bishop's diagonal, creating an immediate threat. Developing the knight to its natural square aims to secure the central pawn and prepare for queenside expansion, though it leaves the queenside slightly vulnerable to further advances. Sacrificing a piece to shatter Black's kingside pawn structure and open lines towards the monarch offers significant attacking potential, forcing a reassessment of defensive duties. Developing the bishop to b7 finally brings a piece into the game, adding crucial diagonal pressure towards White's kingside, which is now looking rather exposed after the recent pawn thrusts and exchanges. This placement immediately targets the d5 square and prepares to challenge the open c-file, potentially creating a strong battery if the queen repositions. It's a pragmatic choice, anchoring the queenside while subtly increasing the complexity for White's seemingly aggressive pawn structure. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain is the primary goal here, creating a pathway for the rook to join the attack on the d-file while simultaneously solidifying the king's safety and preparing potential pawn breaks for further development. Pushing the pawn forward injects immediate central dynamism, challenging White's ambitious pawn chain and threatening to disrupt White's harmonious piece development before it can fully consolidate. Unleashing central pawn thrusts like this often signifies a bid for initiative, aiming to destabilize black's structure and potentially open lines for attacking pieces. The pawn's advance aggressively challenges the d5 square, forcing black to confront the newly established territorial claim and consider how to maintain equilibrium. This injection of dynamism injects immediate tension, demanding a precise response that doesn't surrender vital squares or create lasting weaknesses. Unleashing the queen to b6 injects dynamism into the center, eyeing the weakened e6 pawn and pressuring white's d5 outpost, while simultaneously offering a potential battery formation along the a7-g1 diagonal should black's bishop relocate to a more active square later. Unlocking the kingside blockade, this bishop repositioning aims to reintegrate into the attack, potentially targeting the weakened light squares around black's monarch. Embarking on a daring kingside castle, black boldly challenges white's central grip and injects a potent dose of counterplay into the position, daring white to find a flawless response amidst the burgeoning complications. Solidifying the king's sanctuary after a tumultuous opening, this castling action aims to connect the rooks and prepare them for their dual purpose, defending the monarch and asserting pressure on the central files, or potentially, the queenside should black's pawn structure become a target. It prioritizes safety, a prudent decision given the exposed nature of the kingside following the earlier pawn advances and exchanges. This maneuver simultaneously clears the back rank for further piece development or repositioning, laying the groundwork for a more controlled middle-game engagement. Initiating a pawn thrust on the queenside seeks to disrupt white's central structure and create counterplay before black's king becomes excessively exposed, aiming to open lines for the rooks and potentially target white's more advanced pawns. Intensifying the queenside pressure, the knight rockets to a4, eyeing those vulnerable pawns and seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing to swing over to the kingside if the opportunity arises. Seizing the initiative, black challenges the queenside initiative white has been cultivating with the knight's aggressive foray. This repositioning of the queen aims to undermine white's central control and create counterplay, potentially targeting the c4 pawn or even preparing to activate the queenside majority. It's a bold response, signaling black's intent to steer the game into more active, possibly tactical, waters rather than passively defending. The queen now sits on a more active diagonal, ready to participate in the coming skirmishes. A daring stab aiming to pry open the queenside and disrupt black's developing harmony, though it could also create permanent weaknesses if black skillfully exploits the advancing pawn's exposed position. A daring centralizing thrust, this knight now eyes the critical e4 square and eyes the potential for further infiltration through f3. It bravely enters a complex zone, challenging white's pawn structure and seeking to disrupt the harmony of the enemy forces. This knight's presence here creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces white to reevaluate their defensive setup, particularly around the king. The game's character shifts as black actively seeks counterplay, embracing the inherent risks of such active piece placement. Opening the a-file now grants white immediate attacking potential, forcing black's queen to retreat and potentially isolating her from critical defensive duties, while simultaneously developing a more aggressive pawn structure on the queenside. Unlocking the queenside immediately with this pawn capture, black seizes the initiative and begins to dismantle white's structure, creating open lines that can be exploited. The freed b-pawn now threatens to become a powerful passer, forcing white to react to the positional imbalances created. Unleashing the queen to target the now precarious black king, this maneuver simultaneously seeks to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces. Introducing a knight to the outpost on c6 immediately challenges white's queen and aims to destabilize the queenside structure, creating counterplay by potentially exploiting the weak squares around the pawn chain. A calculated risk is taken here, sacrificing material for what appears to be an attempt to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain initiative. The hope is that by opening lines and creating weaknesses, white can compensate for the lost piece with dynamic play, particularly against the castled king. Whether this sacrifice truly yields enough attacking potential or leaves white too materially deficient will depend entirely on black's ability to defend and white's subsequent precision. The focus now shifts to white's ability to generate threats quickly before black can consolidate their material advantage. Liberating the queen to intercept the rook's rampage, black orchestrates a daring raid deep into white's camp, aiming to dismantle the beleaguered king's protective shield through sheer material advantage and disrupted pawn structure. Forcing a crucial decision regarding the king's safety, this capture aims to shatter black's pawn shield and exploit the exposed dark squares around the monarch. King relocated, the black monarch now stands exposed on the 7th rank, a prime target for the unleashed white queen and bishop, initiating a sudden shift towards aggressive king hunting as the central pawn structure dissolves. Unleashing the bishop to eye the now exposed queenside pawns, white aims to exploit the disruption caused by the exchange sacrifice, looking for opportunities to pry open lines towards black's castled monarch. Activating the central pawn chain offers black a potential outpost for the knight, and an attempt to disrupt white's newfound pawn majority. Re-establishing a central presence becomes paramount, aiming to disrupt the black pawn chain and potentially unleash the rook on the d-file. A bold gambit to disrupt white's pawn chain and open lines for counterplay, though it sacrifices material in exchange for a potentially active knight. Unlocking the c-file with this pawn capture opens a direct assault route for your rook, transforming its position from a passive defender into an active attacker, while simultaneously creating an isolated passed pawn on c3 that might become a future nuisance for black if not properly contained. Unleashing the bishop towards the enemy's weak pawns on the queen side, black aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially create counterplay against the somewhat exposed white king. Unlocking the c-file offers a crucial avenue of attack, finally breaking open the queen side after prolonged maneuvering and creating immediate pressure on black's isolated pawn structure. Black now secures an unexpected central outpost for the bishop, disrupting white's nascent kingside attack and creating immediate threats against the vulnerable queen. Reclaiming the pawn on b7, this move immediately aims to resolve the awkwardness of white's isolated central pawns and reactivate the rook into the game, forcing black to consider how to defend their compromised kingside structure and whether they can exploit the open files before white's pieces fully coordinate. Black finally centralizes the queen, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated structure and potentially create counterplay on the queen side, though the immediate exchange on d4 still leaves white with a clear material advantage and a well-supported passed pawn. Securing the queen side and activating a previously passive rook. Harnessing the open c-file, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside pressure and potentially activate the rook for counterplay, seeking to exploit the temporarily exposed white king. Clearing the diagonals for the bishop allows it to rejoin the fray, aiming to disrupt black's rook's newfound influence on the c-file and prepare for a potential crackdown on the queenside pawns. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, black aims to shatter white's pawn shield and open crucial lines for their rook, potentially targeting the exposed king position. Unleashing an unexpected queenside squeeze, ba3 now aims to cripple black's pawn structure by potentially capturing the c3 pawn, thereby gaining a decisive material advantage and severing any connection black's pieces might hope to establish. Asserting dominance on the queen's flank, this maneuver strategically repositions the black queen to a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and threaten potential discoveries. The king's vulnerability is brutally exposed by this forcing discovery. Seeking refuge for the beleaguered monarch, kd7 attempts to escape the immediate checks and connect the rooks, but its relocation to the center leaves it precariously exposed to white's attacking pieces, particularly the bishop on a3 and the advanced passed pawn on c3. White forces a mating net by exploiting the exposed black monarch, showcasing a tactical geometry where the bishop's diagonal assault creates an unavoidable checkmate threat. The monarch abandons its last protective pawn shield, venturing into a minefield of discovered attacks and potential skewers across the central files. This desperate gambit sacrifices the king's safety for a fleeting initiative, hoping to disrupt white's menacing bishop pair and coordinated pieces before the inevitable material disadvantage becomes overwhelming. Strategically isolating the black king's central security, this bishop repositions to a vital diagonal, aiming to exploit the now open lines and potentially force concessions around the monarch, while simultaneously offering itself for a more active role in the ensuing pawn tussle. Sacrificing the bishop here is a bold attempt to disrupt white's tightly knit structure and perhaps open lines for the rook. The goal is clearly to expose the king or create mating threats, banking on the fact that white's king is quite exposed as well. It's a gambit that trades material for immediate counterplay, hoping the resulting tactical fireworks favor the attacker. The key will be whether this sacrifice leads to a decisive advantage or merely a lost tempo and a worse position. The king's hurried relocation to the safety of the pawn structure, though momentarily arresting the immediate threat, exposes a lingering vulnerability that a more tenacious pursuit could have exploited. Unleashing a forcing check, black injects immediate dynamism into a complex position, aiming to disrupt white's regal safety and potentially simplify the ensuing struggle by forcing exchanges that could alleviate some of the pressure on their somewhat exposed monarch. Unleashing the king from its pawn shield, a bold gambit to disrupt black's tactical geometry and reactivate white's forces. Securing the passed pawn and opening lines for the queen offers a dynamic counterplay, though it invites further checks. Reclaiming central control, the rook on e1 directly challenges black's advanced pawn structure, seeking to disrupt its fragile pawn chain and activate white's own dormant pieces. Suddenly, the black queen swoops in, exploiting the exposed royal and forcing a dramatic shift in the tempo of the game. The king's frantic flight from immediate check leads to a precarious position, forcing a desperate attempt to shield it with the pawn. But this only consolidates black's material advantage and opens up further attacking avenues. The king, exposed and vulnerable on the open diagonal, faces a swift and decisive reckoning as the queen swoops in for a forced sequence, aiming to dismantle its defenses and secure a decisive material advantage. The monarch's exposed position invites immediate danger, necessitating a desperate attempt to reinforce its safety. The rook's repositioning to b7, while seemingly passive, aims to establish control over that crucial file, potentially disrupting white's coordination and creating counterplay, particularly if white's pieces are not perfectly harmonized. Sensing the opportunity to simplify into a winning material advantage, white sacrifices the bishop to shatter black's pawn structure and expose the king. Offering this rook to the 8th rank, the black monarch finds itself exposed, a beacon for the attacking pieces, suggesting a desperate gambit to ignite counterplay before the material disadvantage becomes insurmountable. Unleashing a forcing sequence, the bishop targets the enemy monarch, aiming to capitalize on the exposed black king's precarious position and disrupt any defensive coordination. A critical decision arises for black, with the king now exposed to a deadly battery of pieces after the daring queen sacrifice. The rook sacrifice on a7 unlocks a devastating discovered attack, aiming to shatter the black king's remaining sanctuary and expose it to overwhelming mating threats. King hunt continues, but the black monarch now retreats towards the center, seeking refuge and potentially activating its supporting pieces in a surprising gambit of desperation. The relentless pressure on the black king finally culminates in a forcing sequence, aiming to shatter any remaining defensive structure and expose the monarch to a decisive checkmating net.